welcome to Career Conversations. Can you start by telling us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Hello, Crystal. Thank you for this opportunity, first of all. So my name is Ryan. I'm 30, and I work as a technical compliance manager for a B2B. My interests are, I would say, sports and anything around sports, traveling, hiking, swimming, sightseeing. Mostly it revolves around that.
Wow, nice. Okay. You're a technical compliance manager. Can you tell us how you got started in the gambling industry?
Quite an interesting question. So I've been in the industry for, I think, around 10 years now. I started from, I would say, the ground up. So my first job was at a regulator actually, and my first tasks used to be reviewing submissions made by the operators. So in the regulated industry, you have a number of controls you need to attest towards, and my job used to be making sure that the evidence we receive are actually matching what the operators are saying that they're doing. So it's a lot of verification. We used to call it auditing. I would say it's called information systems auditing. That was my entry to the industry. And then I constructed basically different skill sets around this matter. So risk, for example, risk management, information systems control, and mostly I would say information security. It's the path to achieve technical compliance.
Okay. So Ryan, let's talk about a bit about your role. You work as a technical compliance manager, but for someone not non-technical, can you just give a brief explanation of what it is that you do?
Yes, based on what the business wants. So the business would like to operate in a number of jurisdictions. I mean, in the past, there was the idea of a global license. It still exists in iGaming, because where many jurisdictions now have their own license in the region. So a global license wouldn't actually cover the entire globe. It would cover the entire globe with the exception of the local regimes, basically. So I would say you have to look at the regulations where the business wants to operate in, and you have to make sure that they are translated into key requirements, very clear and detailed requirements, what we need to do in terms of the business to ensure that we are in a position where we can obtain the required approvals to operate in that market. So I would say it's about bridging the gap between law, because you're basically looking at laws and regulations and putting them, translating them into technical requirements for the teams. The teams are not necessarily like engineers or, for example, the administrative IT. Normally, the controls have to be applied in a wider fashion. So the best way to do that, I would say the most efficient way to do that is to work through a risk-based approach. So you have to look at where the major risks of the company are, and you have to attack those areas which are the highest in terms of risk. And by doing so, you are proving both to the assessors, which are normally independent entities, and also to the regulators that what you are doing actually is logical and makes sense. So if you're talking, for example, in the sense of a B2B, as a provider of games, we know that the delivery of the games is the most important thing. If you if you compare what is highly critical compared to what is less critical, I think one could easily reach the conclusion that the delivery of the games is the most critical process. So you have to look at those inputs into that process. So you have human resources, you have technology, you have systems, you have, I guess, say, different assets and different information which you are using to propagate your service to the operators and to the customers. So that would be the most critical as a process. And this is where you have to actually target your controls towards. That's the part where you need to get really spot on. You cannot make mistakes there. Otherwise, you can suffer different repercussions. Obviously, you can have financial repercussions if you do something wrong, which is critically wrong in the sense of the regulation. But you can also suffer operational repercussions and reputational repercussions. And I would say those are more hard hitting than just the financial repercussion in the sense of the now. Because the now is like, okay, you get a fine, you can pay it and just stop there. But what are the repercussions of that? You're gonna suffer reputationally, you're gonna suffer operationally as well, be unavailable for some time. And what compliance tries to achieve, apart from attesting to the regulations and ensuring you are available at a number of markets. I would say compliance, if you want to reach the benefits of compliance properly, you have to allow compliance to enter into the processes. So you have to give compliance enough room to, I wouldn't say manipulate the process, but I would say inspire the process to reach a certain objective. And the objectives have to be closely aligned with the business objectives. And like this, it's much easier to cascade business objectives into actual working programs for the teams because you are making it clear that the intention of this is to satisfy the business objective. And like this, it's much easier to get the required buy-in and also to secure enough commitment from the teams that they will operate within these guardrails we are trying to set.
Okay. Yeah, that was a very in detail explanation. Thank you for that. So let's move on to your KPIs. What are your main KPIs that you own as a technical compliance manager?
So KPIs so you can have different ways how to set KPIs. Normally, I look at it from both sides. So I look at it from a quantitative approach and also from a qualitative approach. Numbers, you can look, for example, at the time it takes you to gain access to a new market. And as long as it's normally I work with smart procedures. So the procedures would be specific and repeatable. And having repeatable procedures gives you a good way to do a comparison. Because if I take a snapshot today and I'm working with a specific process, and then I take another snapshot, I don't know, in 3 months or 6 months, and I'm working with a different process, it's going to be hard to compare like with like. So ideally, you establish a good process, and the process has to respect both the business objectives of the now, but it's also respecting the business objectives of the future. So you're not changing the goalposts midway. Now, when we talk about, for example, KPIs, time to market is a very good comparison of compliance KPIs because you're seeing whether the processes which you set off today and set forward today are actually reaping the reduction in time to market. Because if the time to market numbers are going larger and larger, it could be a bad reflection on the process because the process is so very complex, but it could also be a bad reflection on the approach you've taken to implement the process. So if the approach is not correct, you're gonna get friction on the teams, for example. So the process has to be as lean as possible in order to ensure that this gets achieved within the time you have allocated towards you, basically. So time to market is a very good comparison. But then when we're looking at, for example, the compliance monitoring aspect, because compliance also has to monitor, and it has to ensure that the policy which you are, for example, operating is reaching or is rewarding the required effectiveness and efficiency. So let's say we have compliance, technical compliance revolves around ensuring gaming integrity, for example. So the integrity of the system you are using in order to deliver your sports service, which is a game, for example, to an operator, to a player. So let's say you have business continuity, for example. So business continuity would be applied in iGaming, would be how fast can we continue after we suffer, for example, an incident or a disaster. So let's say there's an incident, and this incident could be anything, like could be a natural incident like a flood. It could also be a logical incident, like for example, a DDoS attack or hacking, malicious attack, something like that. How fast are we going back to available after we suffer this incident? So the process has to ensure that what needs to be collected in terms of evidence is collected, but at the same time it has to be swift. So the response can be done and we bring back the availability where it should have been. So that's another KPI. If, for example, the company is suffering, for example, a number of incidents and this rendering us unavailable, we have to make sure that the process reduces that unavailability time frame. Because the more we are available, it's better for us. And the faster we bring it back to the system, or the faster we switch to a disaster recovery site, the faster we are back available. And availability is ultimately critical when it comes to business, because if you're not available, then the business objectives cannot be. So we have to support that from what we do. We have to ensure that the processes remain as lean as possible, but at the same time, they have to also respect what the regulations require from us and how the regulators are ensuring that we are treating things with a risk based.
Okay. So you're going into the office as a technical compliance manager. Can you talk us through, for example, what your day-to-day looks like?
Yes, so I think there are two major things which compliance majorly deals with. So there is the research part and the fact-finding part where you have to identify, first of all, the posture of the organization you are currently representing. So you need to know where the issues are, where the risks are, where the gaps can be filled, and what cannot be filled as well. And let's say, for example, there's a business need to approach a new market or a new regulation. You have to comply with a new regulation. And you have to provide an opinion, for example, to the leadership of the organization about how far we are or how close we are to achieving compliance to this market, for example. So you have to be quite thorough in terms of your research to make sure that you don't miss anything because you can easily be providing a view which is not entirely correct. And it's not an easy task because to be familiar with FB jurisdictional requirements, obviously massive. So there are ways to do it. Ideally, you follow a consistent ISMS, which already follows sort of international standard, because it's much easier for those international standards and what those international standards give you to be applied to the different local requirements. So if we're talking, for example, in terms of technical compliance, certificate of ISO 27001 is a very strong way to start. Because if you already have that, that means that you already have a certain level of control within your processes, and those processes should be already providing enough evidence in order for you as compliance to prove the company's compliance to the different markets. So I'd say the research and the assessment part is a very important one. And then there are the ongoing actions, the ongoing tasks, such as the ones you mentioned, like, for example, you have an operational team which wants to do a change or wants to implement a new process. And obviously, there is the expectation that it's done fast. But sometimes, yes, sometimes they do miss out on obtaining our, let's say, viewpoints. I wouldn't say it's approval because I wouldn't say compliance job is just to approve or reject. It's more about educating and finding the right solutions because our job is to know where we are operating and what the guardrails are. So we are in a very good position to provide solutions to the teams. Our job should not just be, no, this cannot be done. It should be, we cannot do it like this, but there is an opportunity to do it like this because we are aware of where the risks are, and we can implement certain checks and balances where those risks are not tackled. You can implement compensating controls, for example. I always like to explain this in the sense of a room and the door. So a door, as we know, we need a door to enter a room. So there's no way you can have a room without a door. So the door is a must. We need it. But you also can create access control on that door with a key or with a key card. So those are the methods to enforce the control. The key card or the key is the control, and again the control has to be effective. So let's say we have this key, and access to this room should be to 3 people or to 10 people, but then this key gets distributed to 1,000 people. So we are instantly destroying the control like that. The control is not going to be effective. If that key is only shared with the right people, then the chances are that only the people who should have access to that room are accessing that room. So this is how you can then create controls and measure that because you know where your scope is basically. And you can do that check and balance in terms of that room. So we are ensuring that access to the room is still there, but it's controlled. And we are in a position where we can monitor it, for example, through logs or through cameras, because that's going to give us the ability to go in once every so often, take a snapshot, take a sample of the logs, and make sure that whoever had the right permissions to access this room actually gained access to this room. There are other things which now we're going to spin into. Like, for example, the integrity of those logs. So let's say there are logs of whoever entered that room, but then those logs are modifiable. So if those logs are modifiable, then probably we cannot really rely on the authenticity of those logs. So you need to bridge into the next step, which is the integrity of the data. And to ensure integrity of the data, then you have to do access control again. You might have to do encryption. So it's a big, big web, I would say. You have to be very, very analytical, and pretty much you cannot miss out on anything because you might miss out on just one element, but that one element could be a path to a vulnerability. And this would basically, um, I wouldn't say capsize the entire system, but it defeats the purpose of most of the controls. The controls have to be linked, and you should be in a position where you can measure them, I would say.
I liked your analogy. It really visualizes it, what you're saying, you know?
The door is a very good example.
Yes.
Yes, I spent a good chunk of my career auditing. So I used to go into a company, try to understand what they're doing. The objective used to be, okay, how can I ensure that this company is achieving compliance with? And then you have a variety of standards which you are basically auditing against. And you learn about different ways how things can be done because everybody has his own creative mind. You basically have to immerse yourself into this company and how it's operating and try to understand where the most critical business processes are. And you basically focus on that because one, you don't have the time to go into everything. And secondly, you have to work, as we said, with a risk-based approach. And that enabled me, I would say, to be in a position to shape let's say, the control effectiveness of wherever I'm implementing right now. Because I've learned from those processes which I've seen, also from the mistakes which I've seen, and also from the mistakes which I've made. Because normally mistakes are the biggest eye opener for the future. If you do something today and you get it right, the likelihood is that you're gonna forget it. But if you do something today and you get it wrong, and which could also have some repercussions, for example, you're much more likely to carry that with you in the future, and then you will not repeat that same mistake. And I think the example of the door and the room is really like easy to grasp because I can use that example with basically everyone. I don't need to have a technical audience.
Thank you. All right. So in iGaming, security rules evolve and they vary by market. How do you stay ahead?
Very interesting question. So, as we said, so I think the company, the business objectives are the first leading factor because they will determine how stringent you have to be in the processes you are creating. Um, I've had situations in the past where, for example, the entity is operating in a certain number of markets, and then you want to go up a level. For example, you want to go up to a market which requires certification against ISO 27001. And you start from a situation where you are basically okay with the market's requirements you are operating in, but you need to go up a level. So to stay ahead, I would say you have to know if you're going to be experiencing more changes in the near future. So let's say I want to enter the market X, and that market X currently has ABC requirements, but I know that in the next 2 years, they're going to add D and E to those requirements. So when I'm re-engineering my process from the now to the target state, I have to factor in both the now and also those future requirements which are likely to be implemented. So you don't re-engineer for the next 3 months and then potentially they change something again and you have to start from scratch because it's very counterproductive. And if you do that, I think if you do that regularly enough, you will lose the trust of the teams, of the stakeholder teams, because they will start to think that this statement is not something we can rely on because it might change again. So it's very important that you get the critical part like correct and you don't deviate from that. There will be situations where you can negotiate because you're still going to meet the objective, and that's enough for us as compliance. However, if you want to have something like proper and that something has to be long term, you cannot go with a piecemeal approach. You have to work through a framework And the framework should give you enough benefits to articulate to the teams, what is this going to give us? What's in it for me? And that's a real good way to achieve compliance and to showcase to the teams, listen, we are doing this now. It looks a bit more cumbersome maybe than what we did in the past, but we are doing this to achieve this. And this is going to enable us to do so much. So I think it's a very important step to communicate and to raise the awareness with the teams, not just launch a new process and expect everyone to comply, because things will not work like that. Like you're basically ensuring governance of a process. So let's say the government just creates a new regulation tomorrow and just deploys it on everyone. On the first day, everyone is gonna be in a havoc. You're going to have a mess unless you are informed, showed what is the expected outcome. And then you can much easily align with that and fall in line without disturbing or destroying the current process. It's about ameliorating and re-engineering. Re-engineering is a very important step because you have to understand the current process, where you want to go, what is your outcome. Then you can make fine tuning where possible, obviously, to uplift.
Okay, excellent. Let's move on to tools of the trade. Do you have like 1 to 3 tools or software that you use in your day to day?
Yes, so I would say working on the operator side or working directly in the industry, not as a regulator or as an independent assessor, you are exposed to a number of tools. I think mainly the tool which I use the most is Confluence because obviously I deal with a lot of documentation. And Confluence is a very good place for that. You can communicate, you can collaborate, you can share, you can even provide external access, for example, based on the need. So I would say it's a very good tool to use because you're not working with a lot of documents, updates, and whatnot. You're basically always updating the same space. So you know it's gonna stay relevant like that. And then obviously there are other tools. I use certain platforms to do my research, like Vixion, for example. It is a good tool, which I use, a good subscription. And I would say today, in today's world, AI is a strong contender as well. I don't use AI as Google. So it's not I would say it's not my source of truth, but I do use AI to give structure to what I do because I think the beauty of AI that it can significantly reduce the time you invest in providing a deliverable. So let's say I know what I need to present. I can document that. I can write that down. But then I want to use, for example, certain infographics or certain visuals. With AI, you can reduce the time significantly there. And I think it's a really good tool. And we should not be shy from using AI. I think we need to embrace it. We need to make sure it's properly onboarded in our business processes. AI in itself, when you think about it, it's a risk. It has a number of risks because you can have, for example, you can have um, uh, people inputting certain sensitive data in AI. So, and because you know AI is learning, so it's gonna use that data potentially with other people you have absolutely no relationship with. So there are controls you need to implement also on the AI. So I think we can use AI as a perfect example. Let's say I want to use AI because I need it, but I also need to implement certain controls. How do I do that? You can have managerial controls, you can have technical controls, you have administrative controls. I think a policy is a good place to start because it sets the tone, tells you why you are basically taking this matter and trying to identify certain guardrails, certain rules for it. And then there are technical controls as well, which you can implement. For example, asking for the data to be removed from the system in itself. So if you implement that, could be also an automation which you can use to reduce the manual error of humans because we as humans make mistakes. And automation is another thing. Automation, obviously, it relies on tools, it relies on systems. But when you automate, you are reducing the chances of error by humans. So automation, I would say, is a very strong tool in today's world could also be a good tool, for example, to generate certain reports. So instead of manually going to a tool and asking for the generation of certain reports, automation will ensure that the data is actually finding you rather than you are looking for the data. Of course, you need to look at the integrity of the data as well. So to make sure that you can rely on that data which is being made available to you. But then, as we said, then there's information security, which you need to look at how it branches into the different business processes. Most importantly is always to have a risk-based approach. So you don't invest too much where the requirements are not so stringent, and you focus mostly on the delivery of your service. That's where significant investment has to be done, both in terms of technology, both in terms of the time we allocate to looking at the risks, also in terms of the control implementation. Doesn't make sense to guard a room which contains, for example, documentation which is public, because why are you guarding it? The information is destined for the public. But if you have sensitive data, for example, then you should improve the controls there. You should ensure that you have, for example, a geo control. So it's not just access cards, for example. So constantly you have to evolve based on the risk associated with that process or with that information you have or with that asset which is being used to deliver a service.
Okay, Ryan, let's move on to the topic of the trends and industry insights. Which iGaming compliance trends stand out to you right now?
I think something which I touched upon already is the certification of ISO 27001. Um, Very good starting point. I would say it's the gateway to the highly regulated markets. Personally, I enjoy working most where it's the hardest, highly regulated markets, rather than slowly regulate the markets, if I have to be frank, because it's the most challenging. So you cannot just make small cosmetic changes. You have to look at the wider picture. You have to look at how this is going to influence, maybe from here, it's going to influence somewhere else in the company. So it's a much more holistic change. It's a much more holistic BPR, business process reengineering, when we're going for something highly regulated. I would say in the compliance for today, the trends to go global, to go for the global licenses, because the regulations are constantly increasing. And normally when regulations increase, companies tend to go back to black markets, or rather, let's say, to gray markets. And that could be achieved in some extent through the global licenses. That is a trend which I'm seeing on the upward trajectory nowadays. I think in the industry there's a growing interest on these global licenses. But from a technical perspective, I think for the companies which want to operate in the highly regulated markets, ISO is the gateway. So you need to get there at some point, or at least you need to be in a very good implementation phase of it to secure the assurance and the comfort needed, both from the testing labs, because ultimately you have to go to testing labs. They are the ones which are going to tell you you are compliant or not. And finally, the regulator, which is going to accept the outcomes of what the testing lab does. Mind you, testing labs are not some, small entity which is subjective, etc. Testing labs have to adhere to a number of specific requirements, very, very regulated, very, very specific. Those include ISO 17020, 17025, which basically um, enforce a very strict management system on them in order for them to be deemed qualified or certified to carry out certifications for others. So there's a very stringent process they have to go through, and ultimately then you have to go through them to gain access. So it's about building an optimized structure, I would say, building an optimized compliance program, which is aware of where the different risks are for the entity you are basically representing. And then you have to make sure that the business objectives are the ultimate goal. And what you propagate forward in terms of a compliance program is the means to justify the end. And the end would be obtaining access to that new market, for example.
Let's move on to teams and recruitment. First of all, can you give any tips for someone who's looking for a role into technical compliance?
Yes. So I think the most important thing is the attitude of the person. When it comes to hard skills or technical skills, I believe those are gaps which can be bridged over time and with experience and with the right mentor. If you have the right mentor supporting you and guiding you where you need to sharpen up your skills, I think that's basically what every junior should aim for. when it comes to entering a new role. Fortunately, in the past, I had some really good mentors, which really supported me and showed me where I should position myself most. And I'm trying to do that with my team right now and also with the other teams which I managed in the past. I try to be a mentor without being soft because you cannot be soft. You are soft in the sense that you can accept everything. That would not be a good way to mentor because you're not setting a standard. You're not setting an objective for the team. So I would say the attitude is very important and establishing a good analytical mind. So not just accepting anything which the client tells you. And when I'm saying client, it doesn't have to be an external client. The operational teams in an entity are still your clients when you are compliance. You still have to support them. You still have to guide them. You have to assess them as well and ensure that what they give you is going to hold water when it goes externally. So there are a number of things which are expected out of you as compliance, as a representative of compliance, but the attitude is very important and being analytical. Of course, there are studies which can be done. I've done my fair share of studying to support my role and to further obviously grow my set of responsibilities. So, for example, I did a couple of ISACA certifications. There are quite a lot which they offer, but I did the certification in information systems auditing. I think that was the gateway for me because it's a very broad course. And you can actually apply that to a number of industries. It doesn't have to be gambling. Could also be applied, for example, to a bank or to an insurance company or to a forex trading platform. So it's about auditing. It's about obtaining enough assurance that the system you are looking at is satisfying those three main pillars of InfoSec: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. I did some other studies, for example, certification in risk and information systems control, which is a bit more kind of managerial. So it pushes you to a more oversight role rather than just operating or just auditing. Yeah, obviously, obtaining my lead auditor certification for ISO 27001. That is a important step because you are expanding then your information systems auditing capabilities to cover the entire global standard, which is ISO 27001. So it helps you learn about the different aspects of operations. So I think it's really important. And something else which I studied, I would say quite recently, is data protection and privacy. Because obviously this stems out of information security. If you think about, for example, personal data, let's take my name and surname, for example, in if you do an assessment of the data from a data protection perspective, that would qualify as a highly sensitive data field because there's my name. It could easily identify me. But in business, it's not just personal data which needs protection. You can also have trade secrets or highly confidential business information, which also requires significant protection. So the actual data in itself is not really, it doesn't really matter. How you classify that data matters. How you handle it as a result of that classification matters much more than the actual data which you have. So it's about building the right process and it's about using the skills you have acquired in different jobs, different studies, and you have to try to apply them in the most efficient way. And when I say the most efficient way, it's not just the most efficient for you, but the most efficient for the organization. That's how you can, I think, apply the skills to the best use.
Okay. Thanks for those tips for people exploring a similar role to yours. So let's talk about recruitment when you're looking to recruit for your team, right? First of all, there's CV optimization. Do you have any tips on like, is there something you specifically look out for on the CV? And I also want to understand how easy or difficult it is to find people to work in a role like yours. So yes, let's talk about recruitment for Ryan.
So I think being based in Malta, because I'm based in Malta, it's not so easy to find such people for these roles. I think there's a significant shortage in terms of supply of these people. Funnily enough, when I did my dissertation at university, I had actually studied this gap. I had studied the gaps and the mismatches there are from a technical skills perspective in the iGaming and the financial industries in Malta. And it turns out there was a big gap there. There's a mismatch in the skills as well. And this was done in, I think, 2016. So it's quite 10 years ago. And I can imagine it's only gotten worse nowadays, at least from the local pool. Of course, you can always source um, from foreign countries. But even there, there's a gap because as requirements increase in the world, like on a global level, these people are going to get accounted much more. Because, for example, a country which did not have such stringent regulations maybe 10 years ago now does. So there is a bigger need in that country to have these roles and these people fill it out. So the likelihood is that you're going to find less people to fill up these roles. So obviously we had to adapt. Adaptability is another important thing for a compliance officer. You have to be highly adapted. And obviously, during recruitment, you might have a set of wants which you want from your applicants. Clearly, you're more likely to have done something similar to the tasks which you're gonna have in the past. So you're gonna have more confidence in doing it. But I would say experience does have its drawbacks as well, because you can come into a new company as an experienced employee, and you might have certain things in mind how you orchestrate some things, and you want to do it again in a new company, but maybe the dynamics of the company will not allow you to do that in an optimized way, or maybe there are better trajectories you can take when you are implementing that thing which you implemented in the past. So I would say having the right attitude is the most important thing, willingness to work and having the right initiative as well. Innovation is a beautiful thing. So if the person can innovate and can identify better ways for you to operate every day, that's something which is really obviously welcomed. And I think with experience, innovation is much more likely to happen because when you have a little bit of experience, you've made mistakes and you've also gotten things right. So you're in a better position to say, listen, we can innovate by doing this. Whereas somebody who is maybe less experienced would just know one trick how to do something. So I think it's a combination of both. You need a lot of openness. It's very important. So you need to be open to new ideas and trying to find I would say the strengths and the opportunities of what's being done and trying to apply them to what the market needs from you. You would also need to have the ability to identify where the weaknesses are. If you cannot identify the weaknesses, you're more likely to fail when it comes to implementing the controls because you're not going to see the issues and you are less likely to try to attack them. If you are aware of the issues, at least it's good to have visibility of them and then through the risk-based approach, you can attack where the repercussions are the highest.
So let's move on to the job description and the qualifications. You kind of outlined in detail, but you didn't mention, for example, like what qualifications you would look for when you're recruiting for people for your team. If you can go into that. And also, besides the qualifications, the top three most important things that you look out that needs to be included in a job description.
I think starting from the final question, I think familiarity with certain compliance requirements and certain compliance standards is a very good nice to have because you're not starting from zero. So you're not like getting the new set of requirements and you start from, you know, knowing nothing about them. So having familiarity is obviously is a very good advantage. And I think it positions you on a better ranking compared to other applicants when you're applying for a compliance role. Having some technical skills and experience is a benefit as well. So if you have somebody who, for example, worked in some sort of systems engineering, so let's take, for example, configuring a firewall. So you're not expected to know how to configure a firewall as a compliance officer, but you are expected to know why is a firewall configured and what would be a properly configured firewall in terms of the outputs it gives you. So you don't need necessarily to be technically involved in the implementation, but you need to be understanding of what the technical implementation is going to give you or what it doesn't give you. I think that's a very important thing. So we're talking about knowing the regulations, knowing a bit the technicalities of operation, and obviously you need some soft skills as well because you need to speak to a lot of people. So you're speaking to internal teams, you're also speaking to external teams, you're speaking to leadership, you're speaking to your own team. You need to have good soft skills to articulate what you need, and you have to be direct when you're working with compliance. Otherwise, the objectives are not going to get met. So soft skills are very important as well. When it comes to qualifications, personally, I would always favor a business degree, for example, or an IT degree, not because it's going to give you hard skills, because it's going to give you insights on how business works or how technology works. And you can apply that a bit easier in a bit more easy fashion when you are working. So yeah, having some background in that is helpful. Having a legal background is also helpful because you're dealing with regulations. But for example, personally, I'm not a lawyer, so I still bridge that gap with research, and obviously I support it with some technical expertise as well because I did study IT apart from business. Yeah, I think it's a package. It's a package of things. Experience is a good thing. Um, Technical knowledge is a good thing, and having done some qualifications, obviously, it's going to ameliorate
Yeah,
your ability.
exactly. Okay, so thanks for that. We've reached like the final question. You've worked in compliance for 10 years. Is there something which you've learned over your 10 years which you wish you'd known at the start of your journey?
Um, yeah, I think something which we all realize when we move from university, for example, to the working world is that the working world is much more complex than what we study at university or what we study in a course. So I think something which I already mentioned is really important is the soft skills part, how you approach people, how you communicate the objectives to the people, and also providing the right support to the people, giving them the right pathway to deliver what you need and what the business needs. I think that's really important in supporting them, not just with, I don't know, documentation. Guys, this is the document, we have to do this. That's not going to work.
Yeah.
You need to listen, you need to handhold. You might need to do workshops, for example. I like to do workshops. It serves like a two-way street to achieve communication and collaboration. When we work in a collaborative way with the teams, you're gonna get the best optimum outcome possible, in my opinion. Because you're gonna get the feedback from the teams, and if the teams are being transparent with you about the feedback, then you're much more likely to make the necessary changes before you roll out something. And that's going to ensure that you get the best process possible, at least in the context you are operating in.
Amazing. Okay. Thank you so much for your time and all your insights and valuable information. Thank you and have a nice evening.
Thank you so much, Krista. It was a pleasure.
You're welcome.